An American pilot crashes in enemy territory just weeks before victory in World War II. His family mourns, his government honors him, and everyone moves on. Then 70 years later, his grandson receives a letter that will shatter everything they believed and expose the most shameful betrayal of the Cold War. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 2010, postmarked from Moscow with unfamiliar handwriting across the front. David Morrison almost threw it away with the rest of the junk mail. But something about the careful script made him pause. Inside was a single page written in English, the grammar awkward but readable. The signature at the bottom read Nikolai Petrov, veteran of the Great Patriotic War. David sat down at his kitchen table and read the letter 3 times before his hands stopped shaking. Dear Morrison family, I am writing to you about Captain James Morrison, pilot who disappeared in 1945. I was Soviet soldier who met your grandfather in final days of war. American military told you he was killed in action. This is not true. I saw him alive after Germany surrendered. I have information your family deserves to know. If you wish to learn what happened to Captain Morrison, please contact me. I am old man now, 87 years, but my memory is clear. Some truths should not die with me. David stared at the letter, his mind racing. His grandfather James had been killed over Germany in April 1945, just weeks before the war ended. The family had a folded flag, a posthumous medal, and a grave marker in Arlington National Cemetery with no body beneath it. He pulled out his phone and called his grandmother Elizabeth. She was 92 now, living in a care facility in Virginia, but her mind remained sharp. Grandma, did anyone ever suggest that Grandpa James might have survived the war? Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. Why are you asking this, David? I received a letter from a Russian veteran who says he met Grandpa after the war ended. Says the military lied about how he died. His grandmother's voice changed, becoming harder. Put that letter away and forget about it. Your grandfather died serving his country. That's all you need to know. But Grandma, this man says he has information. I said forget it, Elizabeth snapped. Then her tone softened. David, in 1946, people came to my door asking questions about your grandfather, official people. They told me to accept his death and move on. They told me asking questions would only cause pain. I listened to them for 64 years. Maybe I was wrong. David heard something in her voice he'd never heard before. Fear mixed with regret. What happened in 46? He asked quietly. Come see me tomorrow, Elizabeth said. Bring that letter. If this Russian man is telling the truth, then I've kept silent long enough. Your grandfather deserves better than the lies they told us. She hung up, leaving David staring at Nikolai Petrov's careful handwriting, wondering what truth had been buried for 65 years. David spent 2 days in the National Archives building in Maryland, searching through military records that should have provided clear answers about his grandfather's death. Instead, he found only questions. Captain James Morrison's service record showed a distinguished combat history. He flew 73 missions over Europe between June 1944 and April 1945, shot down 2 enemy aircraft, earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, and received commendations from 3 different commanding officers. Then came April 23, 1945. The mission log listed a single notation: Special Reconnaissance Flight, Solo Departure 0800 hours, Destination Classified, Aircraft Pinun 50 Mustang Tail number 42791. Expected return 1400 hours. Status: missing in action, presumed killed. David photographed the page and compared it to mission logs from the same day. Every other pilot in the squadron flew bomber escort missions to Berlin, or strafing runs against retreating German positions. Standard operations for the final weeks of the war, but James flew alone. No bombers to protect, no ground targets assigned. The archive clerk, an elderly woman named Margaret, noticed David's confusion. Looking for something specific? My grandfather, David said, showing her the mission log. Why would a fighter pilot fly solo in the last weeks of the war? Margaret examined the entry and frowned. Reconnaissance missions were usually flown by specialized aircraft, not fighters. And see this classification marking? That's unusual for routine combat operations. She led him to a different filing cabinet and pulled out casualty reports from April 45. James Morrison's death certificate was dated May 1, 1945, signed by a Colonel Richard Hartman. Cause of death: aircraft lost over enemy territory, remains not recovered. David noticed something strange. His grandfather disappeared on April 23, but the death certificate wasn't filed until 8 days later. Margaret, why would they wait over a week to declare him dead? The clerk studied the document carefully. Standard procedure was to file these reports within 48 hours unless there was uncertainty about the pilot's status. An 8-day delay suggests someone was waiting for confirmation or additional information. David found more oddities as he dug deeper. The initial missing aircraft report mentioned possible sightings near the Czech border, almost 200 miles southeast of where James should have been flying. A follow-up report from April 28 noted Soviet forces had occupied the area and refused American search teams access. Then the file went cold. No witness statements, no debris field reports, no further investigation notes. Just a final memo dated May 15 from Colonel Hartman stating the case was closed and Captain Morrison's status changed from missing to killed in action. David photographed everything and left the archives with a thick folder of documents. His grandfather had flown a classified solo mission, disappeared near Soviet-occupied territory, and been declared dead with almost no investigation. The official story didn't make sense. David drove to the care facility the next morning, with Nikolai's letter and the copied military records in a folder beside him. He found his grandmother Elizabeth sitting in the garden, a blanket across her lap despite the warm spring weather. She looked at the folder in his hands and nodded slowly. "I knew this day would come eventually." "Sit down, David. What I'm going to tell you, I've never said out loud to anyone." Elizabeth reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside were letters, yellowed with age, tied with a faded ribbon. "These came in 1946, she said quietly. 3 months after they told me James was dead. The first was from the International Red Cross in Geneva." David carefully unfolded the letter. The Red Cross logo was printed at the top, and the typed message was brief. "We have received reports of American servicemen in Soviet custody following the liberation of German prison camps. We are attempting to verify identities and locate family members. If you have information regarding Captain James Morrison, please contact our office immediately." "Did you contact them?" David asked. Elizabeth nodded. "I sent a telegram the same day. Told them everything I knew about James, his squadron, his last mission. 2 weeks later, I received another letter, saying they were investigating but could not confirm anything. Then nothing for a month." She handed David another envelope, this one with a U.S. military return address. Inside was a letter on official War Department stationery dated June 19, 1946. The message was cold and direct. "Mrs. Morrison, we have reviewed the stirring inquiry you submitted to the International Red Cross regarding your husband. We must inform you that Captain Morrison was killed in action on April 23, 1945. His status has been thoroughly investigated and confirmed. The Red Cross reports you mention are unrelated to your husband's case. We strongly advise you to accept this conclusion and cease further inquiries that may provide false hope. Any additional questions should be directed to this office." David looked at his grandmother. "They told you to stop looking." 3 days after that letter arrived, Elizabeth continued, 2 men in suits came to my house. They said they were from military intelligence. They asked if anyone else had contacted me about James. They asked if I'd spoken to reporters or foreign officials. Then they told me that pursuing these Red Cross rumors would be unpatriotic and could compromise national security. What did you do?" Elizabeth's hands trembled as she folded the letters back into the box. "I had a 2-year-old daughter to raise alone. No money, no job skills, completely dependent on James's military pension. They made it clear that pension could be reconsidered if I caused problems. So I stopped asking questions. I buried the truth with my husband's empty coffin." David landed in Moscow 3 weeks later, with Nikolai Petrov's address written on a piece of paper, and a growing sense that he was chasing ghosts. The city stretched endlessly in every direction, gray buildings against a gray spring sky. Nikolai lived in a small apartment on the 8th floor of a Soviet-era housing block. The elevator was broken, so David climbed the stairs, his heart pounding by the time he reached the top. The old man who answered the door was thin and stooped, but his eyes were clear and sharp. He studied David's face for a long moment before speaking in careful English. "You have his eyes," Nikolai said quietly. "Your grandfather had the same look, like he was always searching for something." Inside, the apartment was sparse but clean. Photographs covered one wall, showing a younger Nikolai in Soviet Army uniform alongside other soldiers. He gestured for David to sit at a small wooden table. "I have waited 10 years to send that letter," Nikolai said, pouring tea into chipped cups. "Wanted to contact your family earlier, but was afraid. Russia and America, still playing games with old secrets. Now I am 87. If I die without telling the truth, it dies with me." He pulled out a worn notebook, its pages filled with Cyrillic script. "This is my war diary. I wrote everything I saw, even things I was ordered to forget." Nikolai turned to an entry dated April 29, 1945. "We liberated a small German camp that day, maybe 200 prisoners. Most were Polish and Czech, some French. Then I saw the American." "What condition was he in?" David asked. "Bad," Nikolai said. "His leg was broken, he had burns on his hands and face. The other prisoners said he arrived 3 days before we got there, brought in by SS guards who were abandoning their positions. He kept saying he needed to contact American forces, that he had important information." "Did he tell you his name?" Nikolai nodded and turned the notebook so David could see. Even in Cyrillic letters, the name was unmistakable. Captain James Morrison, written in Nikolai's careful handwriting beside the date. David felt his throat tighten. What happened to him? "Our officers separated him from the other prisoners immediately. Said he would be taken to Soviet military hospital, then returned to American custody. I helped carry him to the truck. He was conscious. Told me his wife's name was Elizabeth, his daughter was named Catherine. Asked me to tell them he was alive if anything happened." Nikolai's hands shook as he closed the notebook. 2 days later, my commanding officer ordered me to forget the American pilot. Said he was never in that camp, that I saw nothing, but I remembered. For 65 years I remembered." David returned to the United States, with Nikolai's testimony, and spent weeks trying to find information about the camp where his grandfather was held. Official records insisted no such facility existed near the Czech border, but he knew better than to trust official records now. He contacted Dr. Sarah Chen, a historian at Georgetown University who specialized in World War II prisoner of war camps. She agreed to meet him at her office on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Sarah listened to Nikolai's story and examined photographs of the war diary. Her expression grew more troubled as David explained the location and date. "There were hundreds of small camps across Germany in the final months," Sarah said. "Many were never properly documented. The chaos of the collapse meant prisoners were moved constantly, records were destroyed, and some facilities simply vanished from history." She pulled up a database on her computer and searched through liberation reports from late April 1945. Most camps in that region were overrun by Soviet forces between April 25 and May 2. The Soviets weren't always cooperative about sharing prisoner lists with Western allies. Then she found something. A footnote in a Czech resistance report mentioned a small detention facility designated Stalag-Evan E, located 15 kilometers south of Pilsen. The report was dated April 30, 1945, and noted that Soviet troops had secured the area but refused Czech officials access. David leaned closer to the screen. "Does it mention American prisoners?" Sarah scrolled through the document. "No specific nationalities listed, but look at this." A follow-up report from May 5 says American military liaisons requested information about any U.S. personnel liberated from camps in the region. The Soviet command claimed no Americans were found. She pulled up another file, this one from the U.S. Army's prisoner of war recovery operations. In June 1945, the family of Captain James Morrison submitted an inquiry about possible sightings near the Czech border. The response memo, written by Colonel Richard Hartmann, stated that Soviet authorities confirmed no American prisoners in that sector. "But Nikolai saw him there," David said. Sarah nodded slowly. "The Soviets controlled that territory for months before allowing Allied inspectors access. They had time to remove anyone they wanted to keep, and in the confusion of May 45, with millions of displaced people and prisoners moving across Europe, one American pilot could easily disappear." She found one more document, a sworn statement from a Polish prisoner named Janusz Kowalski, given to American officials in 1947. Kowalski testified that he was held at a camp near Pilsen in late April 1945, and remembered an American pilot arriving shortly before liberation. The pilot was injured and kept separate from other prisoners. The statement was marked unverified and filed away, never investigated further. "Your grandfather was there," Sarah said quietly. "And someone made sure no one would find him." David spent 3 days at the Pentagon, navigating bureaucracy and security clearances before finally getting access to classified mission files from April 1945. A sympathetic archivist named Thomas helped him locate the operational orders for his grandfather's final flight. The file was heavily redacted, black bars covering most of the text, but enough remained to tell a story that made David's blood run cold. Mission designation: Operation Lighthouse. Objective: transport classified cargo from Allied research facility to secure location before Soviet advance. Pilot: Captain James Morrison. Departure, April 23, 1945, 0800 hours. Cargo weight, 42 pounds. Dimensions classified, handling protocols classified. What kind of cargo required a fighter pilot instead of a cargo plane? David asked Thomas. The archivist examined the file carefully. Fighter planes were faster and harder to intercept. If they needed something moved quickly and secretly, a 51 would be the smart choice. See this notation? Priority level designated Supreme Command. That means Eisenhower's office authorized this personally. David found another document, a communication log from April 22. Allied intelligence reported Soviet forces advancing faster than expected toward western Czechoslovakia. Research teams evacuating ahead of schedule. Critical materials must be secured immediately. Then came the crash report, finally unredacted after 70 years. Captain Morrison's aircraft was tracked on radar until 14:20 hours on April 23. Last known position placed him 30 kilometers inside what would become Soviet-occupied territory within 48 hours. Radio contact lost at 14:18. No distress signal received, but there was a handwritten note at the bottom of the page, dated April 27. Intercepted Soviet military transmission references downed American aircraft recovered intact. Cargo status unknown. Pilot status unknown. Recovery operation denied by Soviet command. Thomas pointed to another file, this one marked eyes only and dated May 1, 1945. It was a memo from Colonel Richard Hartmann to Army Intelligence. Recommend immediate classification of Operation Lighthouse under national security protocols. Soviet possession of cargo materials presents significant strategic concerns. Captain Morrison must be officially declared killed in action. Any acknowledgement of his survival or capture could compromise ongoing negotiations with Soviet allies. Family inquiries should be discouraged through standard channels. David felt sick. They knew his grandfather was captured. They knew the Soviets had him. And they decided to pretend he was dead rather than risk exposing what he was carrying. What could be worth abandoning an American pilot? David asked quietly. Thomas hesitated before answering. In April 45, the Allies were racing against time. Nazi scientists were defecting, research was being seized, and everyone knew the wartime alliance with the Soviets wouldn't last. Whatever your grandfather was carrying, someone decided it was important enough that the Soviets couldn't know we were trying to move it. When he crashed and they captured him with the cargo, acknowledging either truth became impossible. They sacrificed him to keep a secret, David said. Thomas closed the file. They sacrificed him to keep many secrets, and they made sure his family would never know. David flew back to Moscow with new questions and Thomas's phone number in case he found more declassified files. Nikolai was waiting for him with another revelation, something the old soldier had been afraid to share during their first meeting. I did not tell you everything, Nikolai admitted as they sat in his small kitchen. After I helped put your grandfather in the truck, I never expected to see him again. But 3 months later, in August 1945, I was transferred to a special facility outside Moscow. A place where the Soviet government kept valuable prisoners. What kind of facility? David asked. Nikolai's voice dropped to barely a whisper. They called it a research institute, but it was a prison. Scientists, engineers, intelligence officers from Germany, Japan, even some from Allied countries, people who knew things the Soviet Union wanted to learn. He pulled out a faded photograph showing a large concrete building surrounded by fences. The image quality was poor, taken secretly from a distance. I worked as a guard there for 6 months. One day in September, I was assigned to escort a prisoner to the medical wing. When we walked past the cells, I saw him through a small window. Your grandfather, thinner and older looking, but unmistakably the same man. Did you speak to him? Nikolai shook his head. Guards were forbidden from communicating with prisoners. But he saw me, and I saw recognition in his eyes. He remembered me from the liberation. The next day, I requested a different assignment. I could not work there knowing an American ally was being held prisoner, while our governments pretended to be friends. Did you learn why they kept him? Nikolai hesitated, then pulled out another notebook, newer than his war diary. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, some archives were opened briefly before being closed again. I found a reference to American pilot Morrison James, held at Institute 12 from May 1945 to March 1947. The file said he was interrogated about advanced aviation technology and classified cargo recovered from his aircraft. What happened in March 47? David asked, dreading the answer. The record just says transferred. No destination listed, no further information. Nikolai's hands trembled. I have spent years trying to find where they sent him. Asked former colleagues, searched through documents, even contacted human rights organizations. Nothing. He vanished from all records after March 1947. Could he have been released? Sent home? Nikolai's expression was grim. If the Soviets released him, your government would have known. They would have told your family. The fact that you grew up believing he died in 45 means someone on both sides wanted him to stay disappeared. David stared at the photograph of the prison facility. His grandfather had survived the war, survived the crash, spent 2 years in Soviet captivity, and then vanished completely while both governments maintained the lie that he died in combat. Someone knows what happened to him, David said. Someone always knows. David contacted every government agency he could find, requesting information under the Freedom of Information Act about prisoners held in Soviet custody after World War II. Most requests were denied or returned with documents so heavily redacted they were useless. Then he received an unexpected call from a woman named Helen Krauss, who identified herself as a researcher for the Defense POW MIA accounting agency. She asked to meet him at a coffee shop in Arlington, Virginia. Helen arrived with a thin folder and a concerned expression. She was in her 50s, gray hair pulled back, and she spoke quietly even though the nearest customer was 20 feet away. Your requests triggered some alerts in our system, she said. We monitor inquiries about specific cases, and your grandfather's name came up multiple times in the past month. Is that unusual? David asked. Helen nodded. Captain Morrison's case has been flagged as sensitive for 70 years. Most families stopped asking questions decades ago. The fact that you're pursuing this actively means someone will eventually notice. I'm taking a risk meeting you. She opened the folder and showed him a document dated 1993. After the Soviet Union collapsed, American and Russian officials established a joint commission to investigate Cold War-era prisoners. The commission reviewed thousands of cases, trying to account for military personnel who disappeared. Behind the Iron Curtain, David saw his grandfather's name on a list titled Unresolved Cases Requiring Further Investigation. What did they find? He asked. Helen pulled out another page. Russian archives confirmed that Captain James Morrison was held at a classified facility near Moscow from May 1945 until March 1947. During that time, he was interrogated extensively about Operation Lighthouse and the cargo he was transporting. Soviet intelligence believed he was carrying documents related to advanced weapons research. Was he? Helen shook her head. According to our records, the cargo was scientific papers and material samples from a German research program the Allies wanted to keep from the Soviets. Your grandfather probably didn't even know what he was carrying. He was just following orders. What happened in 47? That's where it gets complicated, Helen said quietly. The Russian archives show he was transferred to a labor camp in Siberia. Facility designation 231, located near Magadan. Prisoners sent there were usually long-term detainees who the Soviet government wanted to disappear completely. David felt his chest tighten. Did he survive? Helen showed him the final document, a camp roster from December 1953. James Morrison's name appeared with a notation in Russian. Helen had written the translation in pencil, deceased, natural causes, November 1953. Your grandfather lived for 8 years after the war ended, Helen said softly. He was 43 when he died, probably from the brutal conditions in the camp. The Soviets never acknowledged holding him, and our government never pushed the issue because doing so would have exposed Operation Lighthouse. David stared at the date. His grandfather had been alive until 1953, while his grandmother raised their daughter alone, while the family mourned an empty grave. Helen called David 3 days later with news that made his hands shake. She had found something in the archives that changed everything, a report that had been classified and buried for decades. Meet me at the same place, she said. And come alone. When David arrived, Helen was already waiting with a larger folder this time. She looked nervous, constantly glancing around as if expecting someone to stop her. I could lose my job for showing you this, she began, but your family deserves the truth. She opened the folder to reveal a document stamped top secret and dated June 1954, 7 months after his grandfather's reported death. It was a debriefing report from a CIA officer named Robert Chen, stationed in Hong Kong. The subject was a Soviet defector named Dmitry Volkov, a former guard at labor camp 231 who escaped to China and eventually made contact with American intelligence. David read through the report, his heart pounding. Volkov testified that an American prisoner named Morrison was alive at the camp in early 1954, contradicting the Soviet death record by several months. Morrison had become a translator for the camp administration because he had learned Russian during his years in captivity. He was alive after they said he died, David whispered. Helen nodded grimly. Volkov provided specific details. He said Morrison was relatively healthy compared to other prisoners, that the camp commander valued his language skills and gave him better food rations and indoor work. Volkov remembered Morrison talking about his wife and daughter, how he hoped someday to get word to them that he survived. The report continued with Volkov's account of what happened next. In March 1954, a KGB officer arrived at the camp with orders to transfer Morrison to Moscow for additional interrogation. Volkov helped prepare Morrison for transport and remembered the American seemed hopeful, believing he might finally be acknowledged and possibly exchanged. That was the last confirmed sighting, Helen said. After March 54, there's nothing. No records, no witnesses, no documentation of any kind. David flipped to the final page of the report, where CIA officer Chen had written his assessment and recommendations. Morrison's continued detention presents potential intelligence opportunity. Recommend monitoring situation and attempting contact if possible. However, official acknowledgement of his survival not advised, given ongoing diplomatic relations with Soviet Union and classification of Operation Lighthouse. They knew he was alive and did nothing, David said, his voice rising. Helen put her hand on his arm. There's more. After this report was filed, someone in the State Department ordered it classified at the highest level. A memo attached to the file specifically prohibits any official inquiry about Morrison or any attempt to secure his release. The reason given was national security concerns and protection of intelligence sources. They chose to let him rot in a Soviet camp rather than admit what happened, David said. Helen closed the folder. Your grandfather became too inconvenient to save, and then they made sure no one would ever know. David hired a private investigator in Moscow named Anton Sokolov, who specialized in tracking Soviet-era prisoners. Anton had connections to former KGB officers and access to black market archives that official channels would never touch. 6 weeks later, Anton called with information he refused to discuss over the phone. David flew back to Moscow immediately. They met in a small restaurant far from the tourist areas. Anton was a large man in his 60s with cautious eyes and a habit of checking the door every few minutes. What I found could be dangerous for both of us, Anton said quietly. There are people who still want these secrets buried. He pulled out a stack of photocopied documents, pages yellowed with age and covered in Cyrillic handwriting. These are from a private collection owned by a retired KGB colonel. He kept his own records, things that never made it into official files. David saw his grandfather's name on the top page, dated April 1954. The document described Morrison's transfer from the labor camp to a psychiatric facility outside Moscow, a place used to hold prisoners. The Soviet government wanted to silence permanently. They declared him mentally unstable, Anton explained. Standard practice for prisoners who knew too much or had been held too long. Psychiatric hospitals were easier to control than camps, and if a prisoner died there, the official cause was always natural or self-inflicted. The next document was a medical evaluation written by a doctor named Yuri Petrov, no relation to Nikolai. The evaluation stated that Morrison showed signs of depression and memory problems after 9 years in captivity, but the doctor noted these symptoms were consistent with prolonged detention rather than genuine mental illness. Was he sick? David asked. Anton shook his head. The doctor was writing what he was ordered to write, preparing a paper trail in case Morrison died and questions were asked. But look at this notation at the bottom. The doctor had written a single line in smaller script. Patient fully rational, requests contact with American embassy, claims unlawful detention. Anton showed him another document. This one dated September 1954. It was a death certificate signed by the same doctor. James Morrison, age 44, cause of death listed as heart failure. David stared at the date, his throat tight. How do we know this one is real? Anton pulled out one final page, a cremation authorization dated 2 days after the death certificate. There is no grave, no body to examine. They made sure there would be no physical evidence. But there was something else, Anton said carefully. I spoke with the doctor's daughter. Her father died in 1998, but before he passed, he told her about an American prisoner he was forced to certify as insane. He said the prisoner was murdered, made to look like natural causes. David felt cold. Who killed him? The daughter did not know specifics, but her father said orders came from Moscow, from someone high in the security services. Your grandfather knew too much about what was in that cargo, about how both governments conspired to hide him. After 9 years, they decided silence was safer than continued imprisonment. David returned to the United States with Anton's documents and a determination to force the government to acknowledge what happened. He contacted investigative journalists, human rights organizations, and members of Congress who specialized in military affairs. Most showed polite interest, but backed away when they learned how classified the case remained. Then David received an email from a reporter named Sarah Chen at The Washington Post who had spent years investigating Cold War cover-ups. They met at her office in downtown Washington. Sarah was in her 40s, sharp-eyed and direct. She listened to David's story without interrupting, taking notes as he laid out the evidence from the Pentagon files, Nikolai's testimony, Helen's documents, and Anton's findings. "This is bigger than one missing pilot," Sarah said when he finished. "If your grandfather was carrying documents about advanced weapons research and both governments conspired to hide his capture and eventual murder, that's a story about how the early Cold War was built on lies." She spent 2 weeks verifying everything David had found, interviewing sources and requesting additional documents through official channels. The State Department and Department of Defense both refused to comment, citing national security concerns and ongoing classification of Operation Lighthouse. Then Sarah found something David had missed. She discovered a diary entry from a British intelligence officer named Thomas Wright, who had worked with American counterparts in post-war Germany. Wright's diary, donated to an archive after his death in 2003, mentioned Operation Lighthouse specifically. The entry from April 1945 described a rush to evacuate research materials from a facility in Czechoslovakia before Soviet forces arrived. Wright wrote that the cargo included prototype designs for jet propulsion systems and documents about nuclear physics research, materials that Allied scientists had seized from a German laboratory. "Your grandfather was carrying some of the most valuable intelligence of the war," Sarah explained, "technology that would shape the next 50 years. When the Soviets captured him with that cargo, both governments had reasons to stay silent. The Soviets didn't want to admit they'd acquired Western intelligence through capture, and the Americans didn't want to acknowledge they'd lost it." Sarah published her investigation in The Washington Post on a Sunday morning in late November. The front-page headline read, "American pilot, abandoned by 2 governments, murdered in Soviet custody after 9 years." The article detailed everything: James Morrison's final mission, his capture, his years in various Soviet facilities, and the evidence suggesting his death was ordered rather than natural. Sarah included copies of key documents and interviews with Helen, Anton, and Nikolai. Within hours, the story went viral. Veterans groups demanded answers, members of Congress called for investigations, and the Defense Department issued a terse statement saying they were reviewing historical records. David's phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, historians, and other families who suspected their own relatives had been similarly abandoned. But the call that mattered most came 3 days after publication. It was from a lawyer representing the Department of Defense, requesting a meeting to discuss James Morrison's case and the possibility of official recognition. David met with Defense Department officials in a conference room that felt deliberately intimidating, all polished wood and American flags. 3 lawyers sat across from him, along with a Pentagon historian and a representative from the State Department. The lead attorney, a woman named Patricia Walsh, spoke carefully as if every word had been reviewed by multiple departments. "We have completed our review of Captain Morrison's case in light of recent revelations. While we cannot comment on certain operational details that remain classified, we are prepared to acknowledge that Captain Morrison survived his April 1945 mission and was held in Soviet custody for an extended period." David leaned forward. "How extended?" Patricia hesitated. "Our records indicate he may have been alive until at least 1954. "He was murdered," David said flatly. "Your own intelligence reports suggest it." The room went quiet. Finally, the State Department representative spoke up. "We have no definitive proof of the circumstances surrounding Captain Morrison's death. However, we acknowledge that the United States government failed in its duty to secure his release or even acknowledge his survival to his family." "What are you offering?" David asked. Patricia slid a folder across the table. "We are prepared to posthumously award Captain Morrison the Prisoner of War Medal, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and a formal letter of apology to your family. We will also arrange for a memorial service at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors." David opened the folder and read through the proposed citation. It mentioned his grandfather's courage, his sacrifice, and his years of suffering in captivity. But it carefully avoided any mention of government complicity, or the decision to abandon him. This doesn't tell the whole truth, David said. Patricia's expression hardened. It tells as much truth as we can acknowledge publicly without compromising national security interests that remain relevant today. What about the other families? David asked. How many more pilots and soldiers were abandoned the same way? We are reviewing additional cases, the historian said quietly. Your grandfather's story has opened doors we thought were permanently closed. David thought about his grandmother, who died in 2008 never knowing her husband had survived the war. He thought about his mother, who grew up believing her father was a hero killed in combat, which was true but incomplete. The memorial service was held on a cold morning in February 2026. David stood at Arlington National Cemetery, surrounded by veterans, historians, and families of other abandoned prisoners. They laid a stone marker for James Morrison next to his wife's grave, finally bringing him home. As David placed his hand on the cold stone, he thought about all the viewers who might be watching this story from around the world. If James Morrison's sacrifice moved you, please share where you're watching from in the comments below. These stories of forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered.